April 1971, Victoria Harbor, Hong Kong. 7 dock workers later agreed on one detail. It lasted less than 12 seconds. Bruce Lee never spoke about what happened on that loading platform. No police report was filed. No official complaint was made. By morning, the men involved returned to work as if nothing had occurred, except one of them couldn't fully close his right hand. A foreman named Lau kept the memory to himself for years. When he finally described it, he avoided describing the strikes directly. Instead, he talked about the sound, not loud, not dramatic, just short, like with snapping under pressure. The confrontation began as mockery. It ended with a decision. And according to Lau, that decision is the only reason no one died on that dock. What remains unclear is not who won. It's why Bruce Lee stopped when he did. Hong Kong, early April 1971. Bruce Lee had been back in the city for only a matter of weeks, but his presence was already creating friction in places he hadn't even entered. His name moved ahead of him, through film circles, training halls, and eventually into working districts where reputation was judged less by lineage and more by what a man could do under pressure. At that point, Lee was not yet the global figure he would become. The big boss had not been released. There were no box office numbers to reinforce his credibility. What he carried instead was a fragmented reputation, part television actor from America, part martial artist who had left Hong Kong years earlier, and part outspoken critic of traditional methods. That last part mattered. In interviews and private conversations, Lee had begun questioning the structure of classical kung fu, its fixed patterns, its reliance on forms, its tendency to preserve tradition over adaptation. Word spread quickly and not always accurately. By the time it reached local communities, the message had simplified into something more direct. He believed most kung fu didn't work inside established schools. That was seen as arrogance. But among laborers, dock workers, construction crews, transport hands, it was interpreted differently. To them, fighting wasn't about philosophy or preservation. It was about whether something held up when the situation stopped being controlled. Victoria Harbor was one of those places where control was never guaranteed. The docks operated on rhythm and strain. Cargo moved constantly, crates, rope lines, shifting weight across narrow platforms that flexed under pressure. Men worked in close quarters, often with limited footing and little margin for error. Injuries were common, rarely documented. Strength was practical, not aesthetic. It was also a place where stories were tested. According to Lau, the foreman who later recounted the incident, news of Lee's return had reached the dock through a younger worker who had seen him demonstrate techniques days earlier. The description was consistent. Fast hands, direct strikes, no wasted movement. But what stayed with the men wasn't the speed. It was the claim behind it. Too clean, one worker reportedly said. No one moves like that when it's real. That sentiment wasn't hostility. It was skepticism rooted in experience. On the docks, movement was interrupted by weight, by imbalance, by resistance. Nothing flowed cleanly for long. Lee's approach, as it was described, sounded efficient, but also untested in their environment. That distinction mattered more than reputation. On the morning of the incident, Lee arrived for reasons unrelated to the workers themselves. He had a meeting scheduled nearby, connected to early film discussions. He wasn't dressed for training. No equipment, no preparation. To most of the men present, he was simply passing through. But presence alone was enough. Lau remembered noticing him immediately, not because of his posture or stance, but because of how little he seemed affected by the environment. Where others adjusted constantly, shifting weight, scanning footing, Lee moved without hesitation, as if the instability of the dock didn't register in the same way. That difference drew attention. Not admiration. Not yet. Assessment. A few workers paused what they were doing. Not openly staring, but watching in fragments, glances held slightly longer than usual. Among them was Chun Wai-sing, already several hours into his shift, hands marked with rope burns from the morning load. Chun had heard the same accounts as the others. Fast, direct, different, but in a place where physical credibility was tested daily. Second-hand descriptions carried limited value. What mattered was contact, whether a method could withstand resistance from someone who wasn't cooperating. Lau would later say that the atmosphere didn't shift all at once. There was no clear moment where tension became confrontation. It built gradually. A question unasked, a distance slightly reduced, attention narrowing from general curiosity to something more specific. Lee, for his part, did not initiate anything. He remained composed, speaking briefly with a man near the loading area, unaware or unconcerned with how the space around him was changing. What made the situation unstable wasn't aggression. It was the absence of clarity. No one had declared intent. No one had issued a formal challenge. But the conditions were forming regardless. Two different understandings of what fighting meant, occupying the same space without acknowledgement. And in that environment, hesitation didn't dissolve tension. It concentrated it. By the time Chun stepped forward, the outcome wasn't inevitable, but the confrontation itself was. Lau described it in simple terms. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about seeing if he could be stopped. The question wasn't theoretical, and within seconds, it would no longer be controlled. Chun Weising was not introduced. He didn't step forward with intention to perform, and he didn't look toward the others for approval. According to Lau, the shift in his behavior was subtle enough that most of the men didn't register it immediately. He set down a coiled rope beside a crate, wiped his right hand once against his trousers, and adjusted his stance by half a step. That was all. But for the men who had worked alongside him, it was enough to recognize change. Chun was in his mid-30s, slightly shorter than Lee, but heavier through the shoulders and back. His strength wasn't built in isolation. It came from repetition. Lifting, dragging, bracing against weight that didn't cooperate. His forearms carried visible density, not exaggerated size, but a kind of compression that came from years of gripping rough materials under tension. His hands are what most people noticed first. The knuckles were flattened, the skin across them uneven from old abrasions. When he flexed his fingers, there was a faint stiffness, small injuries that had healed without treatment. Lau would later say that Chun didn't strike often, but when he didn't pull back halfway. There was some training behind him, though not formal in the way most schools would recognize. He had spent time in a small Southern-style boxing group years earlier, learning basic structure, how to hold ground, how to close distance without overextending. He didn't continue long enough to refine it, but what remained was practical. He understood pressure. More importantly, he was used to resistance. That made him different from the kinds of opponents Lee had encountered in demonstrations or controlled exchanges. Chun wasn't interested in matching technique. He was interested in whether technique could function when the other person refused to cooperate. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't raised. "Your kung fu, it looks fast." He paused there, not for effect, but as if measuring the next part. But it wouldn't work here. There was no immediate reaction from the others. No laughter, no encouragement. The statement wasn't framed as an insult. It was an assessment, delivered plainly. Lee turned toward him. Witnesses disagreed on his expression. Some said he looked calm, others said focused. Lau's account was more specific. He looked like he was listening carefully, not to the words, to the intent behind them. That distinction mattered. Chun took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to remove any ambiguity. At that range, conversation had a different weight. It wasn't casual anymore. "I'm not saying you're wrong," Chun added, quieter now. "I'm saying it's different when someone doesn't stop." That was the closest thing to a challenge. He didn't name rules. He didn't ask for agreement. But the meaning was clear. Whatever Lee's method was, it would be tested without cooperation, without structure, and without pause. Lau noticed something then that he would only fully understand later. Chun wasn't angry. His breathing was steady. His shoulders remained loose. There was no tightening in the jaw, no visible surge of emotion. What he showed instead was commitment, the kind that doesn't rely on impulse but on decision already made. That made the situation more dangerous than if he had been aggressive. Aggression can break. It can lose direction. Commitment, once engaged, tends to follow through. Lee removed his jacket at that point, folding it once before placing it on a nearby crate. The movement was unhurried, but precise. He didn't respond verbally. The lack of response didn't defuse anything. If anything, It clarified the situation further. Chen shifted his weight forward, testing the ground beneath his feet. The wooden platform gave slightly under pressure. He adjusted without looking down, already accounting for the instability. He had worked on that surface for years. For him, it wasn't a disadvantage. It was familiar. And in a confrontation where environment could influence outcome, familiarity carried its own form of advantage. Lau later reflected on that moment with a kind of unease, not because of what had happened yet, but because of what hadn't. There was no anger to interrupt it, he said. No mistake in judgment. Both of them knew what they were doing. The others began to step back then, not dramatically, but enough to create space. No one instructed them to. It happened instinctively, as if the area between the two men had already been defined. Chen raised his hands, not in a formal guard, but in a position ready to move. His elbows stayed close, his posture slightly forward, prepared to close distance rather than maintain it. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional, and it signaled something important. He wasn't there to test Li's speed from a distance. He was there to take that space away. Lau's final observation of that moment was brief, but it carried weight. Most men hesitate before they start. He shook his head when he said it. He didn't, and once Chen moved, there would be no pause long enough to reconsider. There was no agreement to begin. By the time the space between them cleared, the conditions had already formed on their own. Victoria Harbor's loading platform was not designed for balance. The wooden planks underfoot were uneven, some slightly raised at the edges from repeated use and moisture. A thin layer of salt residue made certain sections faintly slick. Every step required small adjustments, subtle shifts in weight that most men on the dock performed without thinking. Li noticed it immediately. Before setting his stance, he tested the surface once with the ball of his lead foot, pressing down, releasing, then shifting his angle by a few degrees. It was not visible to everyone, but Lau saw it clearly. He didn't trust the ground, Lau said later, so he changed how he stood on it. Instead of planting firmly, Li kept his base lighter, his weight distributed in a way that allowed quick correction. It meant sacrificing some stability for mobility. Chen did the opposite. He settled, his feet spread slightly wider than shoulder width, weight sinking through his hips into the planks. Where Li adjusted to the instability, Chen absorbed it, using familiarity to anchor himself. The dock had never betrayed it before. He treated it as an extension of his stance. That difference, mobility versus rooting, would shape everything that followed. There were no rules stated aloud. No one said no strikes to the throat. No one set limits on contact. No one established when it would end. The absence of rules wasn't unusual for the dock workers, but it created a quiet tension among the witnesses. Because without rules, there was no clear stopping point. Lau positioned himself near a stack of cargo crates, slightly elevated. From there, he could see both men without obstruction. He later admitted that he had considered intervening before anything began, but the thought passed quickly. There was nothing to interrupt yet, he explained. And once there was, it would be too late. The other workers formed a loose perimeter, instinctively keeping distance. No one stood directly behind either man. They understood enough to avoid interfering with movement, even unintentionally. The sounds of the harbor continued around them. Distant engines, water against the hull, the dull impact of cargo being shifted further down the dock. But within that small section of space, those sounds seemed to fall back, becoming less immediate. Attention narrowed. Li raised his hands, but not in a rigid guard. His lead hand extended slightly forward, relaxed but ready, fingers loose. His rear hand stayed closer to his center line, positioned to respond rather than initiate. His posture was angled, presenting less of his body. Chen remained square. His hands came up higher now, elbows tight, chin slightly lowered. It wasn't refined in a technical sense, but it protected what needed protecting. More importantly, it allowed him to move forward without hesitation. Distance between them, just under 2 arm lengths. Close enough to engage quickly. Far enough that the first movement would decide the rhythm. Lau remembered a brief pause. Not long, but noticeable. It wasn't hesitation. It was recognition. Both men were reading the same variables. Footing, distance, intent. There was no confusion left, no misinterpretation of purpose. Whatever this was, it had already moved past words. Lee exhaled once, slowly. Chun shifted his weight forward by a fraction. That was the closest thing to a signal. What made the moment unstable wasn't speed or aggression. It was the absence of structure. In a controlled setting, exchanges follow patterns: attack, defend, reset. Here, there would be no reset unless one of them created it. And neither man showed any intention of doing that. Lau's account of the atmosphere was precise. It felt contained, he said, but not controlled. That distinction mattered, because containment can break. Control, once lost, doesn't return on its own. One of the younger workers later admitted he had considered stepping in, saying something, forcing a pause before it started. But he didn't. None of them did. Part of it was respect for Chun, for Lee, for the unspoken boundary that had formed. But part of it was something else. They wanted to see, not out of curiosity alone, but to answer the question that had been building since Lee's return. Would his method hold when nothing cooperated? Chun made the decision first. His front foot pressed into the wood, testing resistance one last time. His shoulders aligned forward, eliminating any remaining distance in his posture. There was no verbal cue, no warning, just movement, direct, committed, and without intention to stop once it began. And in that moment, the conditions stopped being theoretical. They became irreversible. Chun moved without hesitation. 2 steps forward, short, driving, designed to collapse distance before Lee could fully adjust. His right shoulder came slightly ahead of his center line, telegraphing pressure more than precision. The strike followed immediately, a straight-line thrust toward Lee's upper body, powered less by technique and more by full commitment of weight. It was not fast in the conventional sense, but it did not pause. Lee's response began before the strike completed. A half step off the center line, barely visible unless you were looking for it, shifted his torso just outside the direct path. At the same time, his lead hand made contact with Chen's forearm. It wasn't a block in the traditional sense. There was no hard stop, no collision. It was a redirection. The angle of Chen's arm changed by only a few degrees, but it was enough. The force continued forward, but no longer toward its intended target. In that fraction of a second, Lee's rear hand moved. Witnesses disagreed on the exact point of contact, but Lau's account was the most measured, somewhere between the upper chest and shoulder. Not the head. Not yet. The sound was contained, a short impact, more felt than heard. Chen's forward motion broke briefly. Not stopped. Interrupted. That distinction defined the exchange. Lee did not retreat after the strike. Instead, he adjusted again, 2 small steps, maintaining distance while keeping his structure intact. His hands returned to position quickly, not lingering after contact. There was no flourish, no visible effort to display control, only continuation. Chun recovered faster than some of the witnesses expected. His stance reformed almost immediately, feet correcting against the uneven planks without looking down. The interruption had not disoriented him. It had only delayed him. And delay was not enough. He drove forward again, this time lowering his center slightly, reducing the target area and increasing stability. His arms came in tighter, prepared to absorb impact rather than avoid it. He was no longer testing range. He was closing it. Lee's next movement was sharper. A quick extension of the lead hand, short, direct, met Chen's advance. This time, the contact was higher, closer to the upper chest or lower neck area. It didn't stop Chun, but it forced a subtle adjustment in his posture. Another step from Lee, angled, maintaining lateral space. But the environment was beginning to limit him. The crates behind, Lee reduced his options for retreat. Each adjustment brought him closer to a boundary that didn't move. Chun recognized it. His next surge was more aggressive, not faster but heavier. His left arm came forward in a hooking motion, not wide enough to be inefficient, but broad enough to occupy space. It wasn't meant to land cleanly. It was meant to force contact. Lee intercepted again, this time with both hands briefly engaged. One redirecting the arm, the other positioning near Chen's center line. The exchange compressed rapidly, distance collapsing from arm's length to something closer. less than a step apart. At that range, speed changes. Long strikes lose their advantage. Reaction time shortens. Every movement carries immediate consequence. Chun stepped in fully. His body weight followed through, chest nearly aligned with Li's shoulder. The space for clean technique narrowed sharply. What remained was structure, balance, and the ability to act under pressure without resetting. Lau described the shift with precision. That was the moment it stopped looking like a demonstration. From that distance, both men had to make a choice. Create space or dominate it. Li's posture tightened, his stance adjusting to the reduced room. His hands no longer extended outward. They stayed closer, compact, ready for shorter movement. Chin's pressure didn't ease. If anything, it increased. His right arm came up again, not in a clean strike, but in a driving motion meant to overwhelm whatever defense was in front of it. There was less concern for precision now, more emphasis on force. Li absorbed part of the motion, redirecting what he could, but not all of it. The impact shifted his balance slightly, forcing a correction step that brought him closer to the edge of the crate behind him. For the first time, his space was compromised. The workers saw it. Lau felt it immediately. He didn't have room anymore, he said. Chun pressed forward again. No pause. No reset. The distance was gone, and with it, the margin for controlled exchange. What followed would no longer be about testing technique. It would be about whether control could survive under pressure or break with it. At close range, the exchange lost all rhythm. There is no longer a clear sequence of attack and response. Only overlapping motion, each man acting within fractions of space that barely existed. Chin's pressure became continuous. His left arm came in tight, hooking inward, not clean enough to trap in a formal sense, but effective in limiting Li's movement. His forearm pressed across Li's upper body while his weight drove forward through his hips. It wasn't refined technique. It was control through force. Li's back foot made contact with the edge of a crate. Not enough to trip him, but enough to remove any further retreat in that direction. The wood behind him was solid, unyielding. To his right, the platform narrowed toward open water. To his left, Chin's body closed the angle. Options reduced instantly. Lau noticed the change before anyone else. Up to that point, he was choosing where to move, he said. Now the space was choosing for him. Chun felt it too. His right hand came forward again, shorter this time, aimed more to disrupt than to land cleanly. The strike made partial contact, glancing across Li's upper arm and shoulder, but it carried enough force to compress the distance even further. Their bodies were nearly aligned, chest to shoulder, forearms colliding in tight, controlled bursts of contact. Li responded with a rapid sequence, short strikes delivered from minimal extension. One drove into Chin's midsection, just below the rib line. Another rose higher, contacting near the collarbone. The impacts were precise, but constrained by space. Under different conditions, they might have created separation. Here, they didn't. Chin absorbed them, not without effect. His breathing shifted a slight break in rhythm, but he did not disengage. Instead, he leaned further in, converting his forward pressure into something closer to a clinch, though without formal grips. His objective was clear: eliminate distance completely. In that range, speed mattered less. Structure mattered less. What remained was balance, leverage, and the ability to continue applying force without losing position. Li adjusted again. His stance narrowed, weight shifting subtly to maintain center. His hands moved differently now, less outward interception, more inward control. He began working inside Chin's arms, redirecting pressure in smaller increments. But the environment was still against him. The crate behind his right side prevented rotation in that direction. The uneven planks underfoot made sudden shifts risky. Every correction had to be calculated. Chin surged once more. This time his right arm came high, not as a clean strike, but as a driving motion aimed toward Li's head and upper body. It forced Li to respond immediately. There was no space to evade fully. Li stepped in, not back, not to the side, forward. It was a narrow movement, less than half a step, but it changed the alignment completely. Instead of absorbing the force, he entered inside it, bringing his center directly against Chen's. For a fraction of a second, both men were fully committed. Weight forward, balance on the edge, no distance left. Lau described that moment with unusual restraint. I thought it was over there, he said. Not finished, ended. Because from that position, Lee had a clear line. Chen's posture, committed forward, left his head and neck exposed at close range. The angle was direct. The distance was minimal. There was no obstruction between Lee's hand and a target that could end the exchange immediately. Lee's right hand moved, not fast in the way earlier strikes had been. This was different, shorter, heavier, aligned with full intent. Lau saw it begin, but not complete. It stopped, he said, right before it needed to. The hand halted just short of full extension. Not from interference, from decision. In the same motion, Lee redirected the strike downward, adjusting the angle mid-action. Instead of continuing toward the head, the force drove into Chen's upper torso, just off-center. The impact landed solid. Chen's body reacted immediately, not collapsing, but breaking forward pressure. His weight shifted back a fraction, enough to create space where there had been none. It was the first true separation since the exchange had closed. Lee did not follow. He didn't advance into the opening. He didn't continue the sequence. He reset his stance, small adjustment, hands returning to position, but he held his ground. Chen remained in place for a moment, breathing heavier now. His posture had changed, not weakened but recalibrated. The forward drive that had defined his approach was no longer immediate. The momentum had broken. Lau exhaled then, though he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. That was the point, he said later. After that, it wasn't the same fight, because something had been made clear, not through what was done, but through what was withheld. Lee had reached a position where continuation meant escalation beyond control, and he chose not to cross it. Chen understood it, not intellectually, not as analysis, but as experience, the kind that doesn't require explanation. He took a step back, small, measured, but deliberate, and in that step, the direction of the encounter changed completely. The separation held. For a moment, neither man moved to close the distance again. The air didn't release all at once. It loosened gradually, as if the space itself needed time to recognize that the pressure had shifted. Chun stood where he had stepped back, shoulders rising and falling with controlled breaths. His hands remained up, but lower now, not in surrender, not in readiness, but somewhere between the two. His weight was no longer driving forward. He looked directly at Lee, not searching for an opening, assessing what had just happened. Lee didn't advance. His stance remained intact, but the intent behind it had changed. The tension that had carried through each movement was no longer building. It had leveled off, contained, but no longer escalating. Lau stepped down from the crate then, not to intervene, but because the need to stay elevated had passed. The other workers didn't move closer immediately. They held their positions, watching for any sign that the exchange might resume. It didn't. Chen lowered his hands first. The motion was slow, deliberate. There was no visible frustration, no attempt to reassert himself. He flexed his right hand once, then again, subtle, almost involuntary. The stiffness had already begun to set in. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. He didn't repeat his earlier statement. He didn't retract it either. He simply said, "Enough." It wasn't a concession in the formal sense, but it ended the encounter. Lee gave a small nod. Nothing exaggerated, no acknowledgement beyond what was necessary. He stepped back once, creating a neutral distance, then turned slightly toward the crate where his jacket rested. There was no conversation between them after that. No exchange of names. No attempt to define what had occurred. Chen picked up the coiled rope he had set aside earlier. When he gripped it, his fingers didn't close fully. He adjusted his hold, compensating without drawing attention to it. Work resumed around him in fragments, slower at first, then gradually returning to normal rhythm. But the atmosphere didn't fully return with it. Lau noticed the difference immediately. Men were quieter, he said, not because they were impressed, because they were thinking. What stayed with them wasn't the speed of the exchange, or even the outcome. It was the moment inside it, the one where continuation had been possible and expected, but didn't happen. By the end of the shift, Chin's right hand had swollen slightly along the knuckles. He avoided heavier tasks, shifting to work that required less grip strength. No one commented on it directly. On the docks, injuries were common. They were noted, but rarely discussed. Still, the others had seen enough to understand the cause. Lee left the harbor shortly after. He retrieved his jacket, brushed a thin layer of dust from the sleeve, and walked out without looking back. There was no visible sign of exertion, no heavy breathing, no adjustment to his posture. But Lau, watching from a distance, noticed something else. He kept his hands still, he said, like he didn't want to feel them. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but it suggested something beyond physical control, something closer to restraint that required effort, not ease. In the weeks that followed, the incident was not widely shared. It moved quietly, passed between workers, occasionally mentioned in fragments. Details changed slightly depending on who told it, but one element remained consistent. The ending. Not the strikes, not the movement, the decision. Among men who measured strength through application, that detail carried unusual weight. It reframed the encounter, not as a demonstration of superiority, but as an example of control under conditions that didn't support it. Years later, when Lau was asked why he remembered that morning so clearly, he didn't describe the exchange in full. He focused on a single point. "I've seen men go too far," he said, "sometimes by accident, sometimes because they don't know how to stop." He paused before continuing, choosing his words carefully. That wasn't the case here. He looked toward the harbor as he said it, as if the setting itself still held part of the memory. He knew exactly where the line was. Lau didn't claim to understand how Lee had developed that level of control, or what it cost him to maintain it. He only knew that, in that moment, with no rules and no structure to rely on, the decision had not been automatic. It had been made, and it had changed how those who witnessed it understood strength, not as something proven at the point of impact, but as something measured in the space just before it. The dock returned to its routine. Cargo moved. Shifts changed. The platform remained the same, uneven, unstable, indifferent. But for those who had been there, the memory didn't fade into exaggeration or myth. It stayed precise. A short exchange, less than 12 seconds, and a moment inside it where ending the fight would have been easier than stopping it.